Hello. It's so glad to have everyone here with us. We have an accelerated hour. This hour is going to be defined as 50 minutes. So we're going to get through it as quickly as we can, but go as deeply as we can into the topic that we're going to cover today. We're going to be spending some time digging in to try and separate fact from fiction and risk from reward in the context of AI and the reality of AI today. As we've heard throughout the summit, AI is becoming a generation-defining technology, right? President Biden has said that AI is the most consequential technology of our time. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella has said that we are in the so-called golden age of AI. So we all have seen over the last few days in the conference that headlines and proclamations around AI are plenty. And we're hearing about how AI is both going to solve all of our problems and also how it's going to be the end of humanity as we know it. So we're going to try and get in a little bit today with the panelists to figure out what's actually real about these proclamations. I wanted to mention, so I've been involved in the field of responsible AI for several years now, since 2016 or 2017. And a lot of things have changed over those years, but a lot has also stayed the same. So my initial foray into this, when I first began working on it, responsible AI was a remarkably fringe thing. And so that's especially so in the area where I was working, which was focused on the Global South, international development and humanitarian assistance. But this was a reality where we basically had to go and knock on doors and pitch the idea that AI was something that needed to be front and center and that people needed to understand both the exciting potential but also the risks inherent in the technology. And I think, as we've seen, that has completely switched, right? My colleagues at USAID now are barely keeping up with the demand that they're facing within the agency. I think that's true across the board, that there are more questions now and more excitement and enthusiasm about responsible AI than ever before. But what has stayed the same? I think it's also true still that AI is very, very incredibly hyped, right? And sometimes that's merited, sometimes that's not. And we want to better understand where there's really potential and where risk is overhyped, where it's actually a true thing that we need to grapple with. So I think, as we're talking through all of these different headline type proclamations, we want to get a better sense of the actual situation on the ground, the specifics, right? What does it look like in practice for AI to work the way that we intend it to? What risks are most imminent with the AI models that we've been talking about, and which are being readily incorporated into daily processes. So these are things that we really need to better understand where the risks are present and where they're not. And then where does the field of so-called responsible AI stand in light of all the recent developments we've been talking about, right? The field has evolved for a long time. It predates large language models, and that changes a lot of our understanding of where the specific risks come, where the harms come that we need to contend with. So with all of that, I think we see that AI readily splits folks into two ideological camps, all too readily. The doomers, and then also the technophiles, and so on either ends of the spectrum. And it's never that simple, and I think hopefully we'll go into all the ways that it's not that simple with the panel today. So without going into this anymore, I want to dive right into questions. So Ravi, I want to start with you. You've been in this field as well, right? Responsible AI has been your area of focus for quite some time. You've had a lot of experience understanding how different domains engage with this concept, and also how different stakeholder groups interface and how they engage with the concept of responsible AI. So industry, academia, civil society. So I want to start with you and hear a little bit about your experience in the field, how you've seen it evolve, and what you think are the most salient things to focus on in this conversation.
Sure. So, like you rightly pointed out, right? So responsible AI is not something that started with large language models. People have been engaged with it for a while. But unfortunately, the last people to come to the table have been the technologists. So I've heard people comment about how responsible AI is for people who want to do AI but don't have the technology skills to actually get into the field. I mean, I've heard actually comments about that, right? So, and now things are changing, right? right? So people are understanding that there are multiple aspects to AI, right? So since AI is impacting so many facets of society, so we really have to understand, just like any when people typically talk about understanding AI systems and explaining AI systems and then talking about fairness and ethics and so on and so forth. But more recently, people have also started talking about safety of AI systems, right? And how that is, how deployment of AI can lead to catastrophic outcomes if not thought through completely. Right? So there are multiple facets to both developing and deploying AI systems and how to do that responsibly. And this cannot be done just by technologies alone. At our center, so we had trying to create a platform wherein we have people from technology, from civil society, people who are looking at the legal aspects of technology, right? And the end users, right? And also policy makers. We're trying to give a platform for multiple stakeholders to come in. And it has been, for me personally, as a technologist, has been very revelationary listening to these discussions and looking at how people have really valid concerns about some things which people in technology take for granted. So one example is talking about not needing regulations for the technology itself, but only for the applications of the technology. So, but I was engaged in a conversation with a lawyer, and she was telling me that, look, you might not want regulations on technology, but technology is going to be taken to court. So you would really need guidelines, a legal framework in which these can be addressed in court. Just technology is wishing away regulations on the core technology is not going to solve this problem. And that was a very a new viewpoint for me. I mean, I'm sure there are others who would disagree with it, but that had not even entered my landscape. So things like this, right? So this is possible only when you have dialogue, cutting across multiple stakeholders. That's possible.
Speaking of stakeholders, such as technologists, I want to move over to Sunil. So I know one of the big issues that I want us to spend some time on is this debate between open versus closed. And so with Meta, obviously you recently launched Llama 2 as an open source model. This is something that you all have been long involved in and clearly have been pushing for. I want you to talk to us a little bit about both the ideology behind that, but also just the fundamental design choices, right? What underpins that? What does that actually look like? What does it mean? I also wanted to, so first off, what's behind this raging debate between open and closed systems? So that's one thing that I want to hear your perspective on. And specifically, I want you to walk us through, and Leah, I'll ask you about this as well, but I want you to walk us through what's new in the context of open source AI that may or may not be distinct from what the historical kind of open source community has pushed for, right? What are the distinctions there, if any? And then second, so beyond the open versus closed term in terms of source code, there are other ways to foster transparency, right? And so I wanted to ask you, and this is a broad question, but I'll start with you, Sunil. So recently Stanford released a foundation model transparency index that essentially had all the big tech actors receiving a failing grade, right? And so that's in spite of open source, open access. So I want you to talk us through what are the other necessary aspects of openness that tech companies are facing choices on here and how you walk through those choices. So things like model weights, things like data sets, training code, all of the above. So a lot in that question, or 7 questions, but if we can kind of evolve a little bit, that would be great.
Thanks, Obra, for that question. And there's a lot there. I hope I can do justice to the question, but thank you for sort of connecting the question you posed to me to the question that you're going to pose to Leah. I think most economists will agree that open source software is a digital public good because it meets the definition the economist's definition of what is a public good. And in that way, corporations like Meta can contribute to India's vision around digital public infrastructure by providing the building blocks for that digital public infrastructure, which is open source software or digital public goods. Llama 2 is the latest blockbuster movie from Meta, and that's why it has gotten a little bit of a reputation. But that doesn't tell you the whole story. Mark Zuckerberg has been committed to using open source software from the very beginning. That was the software stack that he chose when he started building Facebook. And soon he realized that if he had to cut hosting costs, he would have to design his own data centers. So the very first open project at Meta is Open Compute. It's not a pure open software project, it's an open hardware project. So if anybody would like to build data centers like how Meta builds data centers, then you can go to opencompute.org and you can replicate the best practices that we use at our data centers. So from the very beginning, open hardware was something that Mark Zuckerberg felt strongly about, and that has continued. If you look at the latest edition of the State of Open Source report from Meta, available on a public blog, you will see that we have 1,200 open source projects. What I haven't managed to confirm is whether there is significant overlap between that count, 1,200, and the count that you can see on Hugging Face. If you go onto Hugging Face, you will see that Meta has released 650 AI models under open, near open, or permissive licenses. So that's just to make that initial point that Meta is deeply invested in open source. It's not just Llama, it's not a new bandwagon that we have gotten onto. And we're very serious about it, unlike our peers. PyTorch, which again I would consider a DPG, because more and more DPIs are going to use AI, and some of them may use PyTorch, is an open source project from Meta. Meta donated the whole project, all the copyright and the trademarks, to Linux Foundation. And now if a government or a business wants to make a bet on PyTorch, they have a little more certainty in terms of governance because it is no longer the sole project of Meta. It is controlled by an independent foundation. But coming back to this question you posed, Obra, which is ideologically where do we stand? We are non-dogmatic about open source. That means we do have many proprietary products as well. And when each model is developed by our internal research teams, we ask the question, what kind of risks do these models pose, and should this model be openly released, or should it remain a proprietary model? A good example of this is VoiceBox. VoiceBox is a model that can be trained on a 3-second sample of anybody's voice. And after that training is done, VoiceBox can artificially synthesize that person's speech, replicating accent, and etc. So that model, because of the deepfake risks, we decided not to make it open source. It remains a proprietary model. And the transparency that you're talking about is afforded in a completely different modality. And this is thanks to work of academics like Margaret Mitchell, taking forward the tradition of model cards. So you have limited, not full source code transparency, but transparency about how much compute was used, how much carbon was burnt, what kind of data sets were used to train the model, etc., in the model cards. But going back again to dig a little deeper into this philosophy question you're asking, and connecting it to the point that Professor Ravindran made around safety, if there is a regulated entity, a corporation, an academic organization, that makes a very specific safety claim about the model that they are releasing, then the only way that we can conclude with scientific confidence that that claim is correct is if we embrace the whole open science paradigm and not just open source. And by that I mean we need the source code to be available for public scrutiny. We need training data sets, ideally under open data licenses. We need a scholarly paper accompanying the release of the model available using an open access paradigm. So open access plus free and open source software plus open data, all of that comes together to create open science. And only then can you have full reproducibility in the tradition of science, and independently people can confirm a particular safety claim. And then if you move to another area, which is security, and I think the very same test works even for safety, given sufficient number of eyes, all bugs are shallow, and a model that is interrogated, scrutinized, examined by a variety of stakeholders is going to be more safe, more secure, etc. On every parameter, we think those models will do better. And going to the sort of historical precedent to this, did you say Stanford that released the? Yeah. So the transparency report from Stanford, I guess, is faulting models for not releasing training data, not releasing the full source code repository, with all the details, not using standard open source licenses. So there are two modifications to open source licenses that we need to worry about. The first set of modifications are safety-related modifications. I think broadly, folks will agree that those are modifications that are useful from a safety perspective. And then there are modifications that are not connected to safety at all. Those are the modifications that have been criticized at this very forum earlier as well. And I would say don't judge Meta's posture by a single project and a single license. There are 650 other projects and licenses that you should also judge us by. So again, very quickly rewinding into history, I've been using open source since the end of the 90s, and when I was installing Linux distributions then, and I don't know if anybody in the room has played around with Linux distributions then, the graphic card wouldn't be supported. You couldn't play MP3s out of the box. To make your Linux desktop a usable desktop, and if you were not a Stallman-esque in your embrace of freedoms, then you had to have proprietary drivers on your desktop. There was no way to completely eliminate the proprietary world on your desktop in the 90s. Today in 2024, I just reinstalled Ubuntu. It is possible to be mostly free and have very little proprietary technology on your computer. So similarly, in 20 years, my optimistic prediction is that models will get more and more open, and there will be a virtuous race to the top.
That's a very nice prediction. I hope that we can follow that. But you raised some really good points, and on balance, transparency is much bigger than just open source, but it also will take some time to figure out what the components need to be and how we put in place the different building blocks that really allow us to not rely on some proprietary systems as well as open, but figure out what needs to be closed versus open. Leah, I want to turn to you specifically about some of those things, and also the mention of how you can aspire for transparency, even if it's not based in open source or open code. Things like Margaret Mitchell's work and model cards and ways to describe the details of models or the components of models without fully releasing everything. I'm curious about your perspective from the Digital Public Goods Alliance vantage point. Where you think we are today in terms of openness? Do you feel like the approach to open source models is sufficient? Do you feel like we're getting there? The work that you've been doing. And I also want to make, and specifically, are we living up to principles of openness? Not just putting open source code out there, but living up to principles of openness in the context of AI, given all of these different kind of competing needs and tensions, specifically around safety, right? Where we are better served by closed source or restrictions about who can access. But I also want to go back to something that was said several times today and probably throughout the conference around what more needs to be done in terms of access, because part of the motivation for opening things up is to increase access to these, economic driving models, right? AI should be something that everyone can access, and there's a divide right now between global north and global south. This has been mentioned a few times, and so as that's one of the key motivations for openness, what more needs to be done in the context of this for greater access? And specifically just going back to this point of, is open source always the right model? And if not, because of safety or whatever, how do you draw those thresholds? How do you create those boundaries so that you're staying true to the principles of openness, even if you're not able to fully open because of safety or other reasons? Again, a lot there, so would love to hear your thoughts, Leah.
Yeah, that's not one question. I think that's like 3 or 4, so I will do my best to answer all of them in due time, of course. Firstly, maybe let's start with the open source definition, right? Because currently there is no agreed upon open source definition for AI. So that's something that we need to acknowledge. And looking at the open source definition for software, I would say, and others say this as well, that Llama, for instance, wouldn't qualify as open source under this provision of the open source software definition, because there are use restrictions baked into the license, simply for that reason. And there are currently several work streams underway that are trying to define open source AI with the community to better understand, okay, what would we actually need to open source in order to maintain the benefits that we see in open source software, right? What Sunil already mentioned, transparency, accountability, the ability to modify a system, and also reproducibility if you want. From a DPGA perspective, we think that reproducibility is probably not the benefit that we should focus on. We should focus more on transparency, accountability, and enabling others to build on top what is already out there. So it comes down to modifying a system and being able to do that. So what would you need in terms of openness to do that as a developer, right? And at the DPGA, we realized that probably it's not the full training data set, for instance, that you would need. And I think this helps a lot to solve for the open source problematic when it comes to privacy and protecting data that should be protected. What you probably need is a good understanding of what the data is that the model was trained on, but it doesn't come down to having access to the full data set. It could be synthetic data model on the original data set. It could be a snapshot that is representative of the data that's used for training. And it could be also hosted access, right, that you would need to require to get access to the data set, but it's not out in the open as such. So I think there's this gradient or this nuanced approach to openness of AI systems, and I hope that this discussion is also going to involve in the process that the open source initiative is currently undertaking, as well as what the Linux Foundation is doing on developing a framework for machine learning components openness. And I think what we really need to solve for is what is responsible openness in that sense. So where can you make components openly accessible and do this in a responsible way? And where should you probably also, keep it closed, basically. In terms of where we currently stand, there are studies out there, right, that analyze existing models, where they stand in terms of the openness of the different components. What did they publish? Is it like the full training data set? Is it like the trained weights? Is it just the weights? Is it the inference code? And so on and so forth. So I think that's already widely available, and we see, we just need to go to Hugging Face, to the open source LMM leaderboard, which models are out there and which perform at a really good level. So we see that there are models out there that are open source or as good as open source, which others can build up on. And I think that's great to see. Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to the fact that, at least if you look at large language models, they might become like a foundational infrastructure other applications are building up on, like the downstream use of those foundational models. And I think it's important that these are as open as possible to inspire innovation and to inspire also competition, because that ultimately also benefits quality. So if you have a model that is highly biased, it probably will not be used much because you get bad results, customers are not happy with these results, and that's a reason to improve. So that's I think, an important part. Then on the question of, is open source always the best solution? I think there are two components to this discussion, if you narrow it down. One is the aspect of protecting data and privacy. So you need to make sure, of course, that a model doesn't leak PII, and you need to account for that upfront, of course. So don't open source a model and then realize, oh, it's actually leaking private information, so that shouldn't be. So this should be taken account of before we do that. Sadly, we currently don't have any open sourcing standards, so when is it actually safe to open source a model? Right? In the open source software world, we have seen that that's not achievable. You can't monitor downstream use of an open software project. People fork it, people do whatever you want with it. I think when it comes to AI, it's a good idea to think about not so much about the application and misuse in application, but misuse in conduct. And if you look at this more than on the application side, you can actually go deeper down into the stack and identify bottlenecks where everyone needs to go to, no matter what kind of model and for what purpose they're developing it. So for instance, everyone that is developing AI, they need to go through cloud infrastructures. You need cloud providers. So one idea could be, for instance, to put the liability on cloud providers to make sure that the model is not misused. And they will develop measures accordingly to account for that, right? Or you could say, like in other industries, you need to have a license in order to operate a model. So I think there are different stages that you could use. I guess I would get a lot of bashing from the open source community saying this, because clearly that is not falling under an open source definition anymore, at least not in the ideological sense, but it would help to account for these risks and at the same time ensuring that others can build on a model and innovate on top of it.
Yeah, lots of really interesting thoughts there that may or may not resonate with the open source community or those cloud service providers who would be held liable. And, there's a lot of different stakeholders to consider there. Who are partnering along these lines have, of course, differed in how they've approached the principles and putting the principles into practice and how that guides at a country level what AI governance looks like, what responsible AI looks like. I'd love to hear from you what role you think organizations like OECD can play in the governance of AI that both foregrounds the seriousness of these risks and kind of drives for greater consistency in how some of these risks get addressed and mitigated. But also respecting sovereign rights and some of the issues that have been brought up here, right? Respecting the need for competitive innovation and things like that. So how do you see the OECD's role in that complex landscape? And then also just as the principles evolve in the coming years to try and account for some of the evolution of the field, right? With large language models and some of the safety risks that do get posed by those advances. How do the principles need to evolve, or how do you foresee them evolving, as well as you try to work to reflect a greater diversity of priorities from, again, not only global North countries but global South countries? How are you squaring that circle? And we're having trouble hearing you, so I'm not sure if that's on your end or ours. So, Audrey, I'm sorry to say we still can't hear you. I'm not sure if someone from the team can help with muting. You want to try one more time, and then we can come back to you if there's technical issues? Yeah, still not hear you. We'll come back. Would love to hear from you soon, so we'll wait to hopefully somebody from the team can figure out what's going on. Maybe we can jump to Mattis if we're not technically limited right now. So Mattis, can we hear? Yeah, we can't hear you either. I don't know if someone from the Carnegie India team can help with technical difficulties on this one, but I think it would be very valuable to be able to hear from Mattis and Audrey. So if that's okay, would love some support. So we can come to Eunice. So we're trying, virtual participants. We want you to be part of the conversation. Soon you will be part of the conversation. But let's move on to Eunice. So maybe it's a good segue, actually. So, Google historically and for quite some time has been really vocal about prioritizing safety in the way that you've developed AI, the responsible AI principles your colleague was talking about earlier today. This has been a priority for Google for a long time. With the release of the competition that's arising around generative AI models and the race to release generative AI models, like Bard, decisions are taken about how quickly to go forward with releasing openly. And I'm curious, as you have seen the principles influence decision-making within Google, both in the context of large language models, but also historically. Can you talk us through a little bit the process that you have of evaluating the safety of models, evaluating when it's the right time to cross the threshold of still working on it versus releasing into the wild, and how you all put the kind of responsible AI practices, principles, and that ethos into practice internally?
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara, for the question. So I think the way that I think about it is, 4 Ps, right? Like, it's not just the process, but I think fundamentally you start with the principles. We had our principles released in 2018, and one of the principles, we had 7 do's and 4 don'ts. One of the 7 do's is build and test for safety, right? So it's enshrined in almost our North Star, what our engineers will sort of internalize and sort of the way they work, right? The way we think as a company about AI. So I think that's key. The first P really is starting from the principles level and having that permeate the company, a safety culture, right? Like safety first in the way that we build products, the way that we design products, the way that we deploy products. The second P that I think about is process, right? So once you have that principles, how do you execute that, right? You can have very high-level principles, but the devil's in the details, and the devil really is in the execution. We set up, after the principles were released, we set up a responsible innovation team that for every product launch, they have to evaluate that. They do ethical testing of the products, for bias, for safety, and they also do adversarial testing, right? Adversarial testing, red teaming, relying on internal, external experts to really test for a whole wide spectrum of vulnerabilities, potential areas of abuse, and also more complex societal risks like bias, fairness. And this really helps team to systematically improve the products. It doesn't mean that the responsible AI team rubber stamps things. Like there are instances where they say, no, it's not ready. And we need certain product modifications before it can be released with conditional release. And then the third is really not just process but product, right? The way that the products are designed for safety is also critical. So with BART, I think this morning Markham was talking about how we during this whole sort of testing process, we found out that actually it could be potentially misleading to have BART use I statements, right? I recommend that you do this, or I recommend that you do that, to have human-like characteristics. So we limited the use of I statements, and you'll see that actually if you use BART, there's also to deal with things like hallucination. The way we design it is to put in a Google it button, right? To double check, because we know that these problems exist with generative AI products. And the final thing that we do with the P is really policy, right? Before we release it into the wild, and I really don't think it's releasing it to the wild, to be honest, like because of the robustness of the whole process. Sort of creating prohibited use policies, right, for generative AI. So if you look at our policy terms of conditions, you see that you're, as a user, you're not allowed to use BART to promote violent extremism. You're not allowed to use BART to facilitate or distribute spam. So I think it's the combination of the four Ps that makes it a more robust way of testing, iterating, designing, incorporating these safety considerations into the way the products are designed, and then when you go out there, have very clear policies on what it can or cannot be used for.
Can I ask a very brief follow-up before we
Yes.
go to our virtual participants?
Yeah.
How often do you internally revisit this whole process to say, is this good enough? Do we need to revise it? Are there things missing? Is that something that's built in, or is it not?
I think, so on the principles level, we see principles are quite durable and enduring. But we have 200 over people working on whose full-time jobs are responsible AI to test against our principles. So I think the process is iterative as well. I don't think it's necessarily always static.
Yep.
But there is a process internally that it has to flow through before launch is approved.
Yeah. Thanks, Eunice. So let's try again. Test our luck. Audrey, can you try and say hello?
Hello.
We can hear you. Wonderful. So let's hear your answer to my question posed previously on how you see the role of the OECD in the context of how countries navigate the principles and putting them into practice and navigating that with sovereignty. Please.
Thank you so much for the question, and apologies for the challenges earlier. And sorry to not be with you in Delhi in person. It's been a crazy season of meetings here at the OECD, many of them AI related, so I appreciate the opportunity to participate virtually. As you said, the OECD AI principles are a really foundational piece of work that came out of 2019, and they have very much stood the test of time. We're in the process of considering how they've been implemented. It's a process we undertake regularly at the OECD with regard to our recommendations and legal instruments. But it's important to know that the principles have 5 values-based principles and then 5 policy recommendations. And the policy recommendations are really, they can be implemented anywhere. They don't have a direct sort of impact about sovereignty. It's not a zero-sum game trade-off. So they talk about things like investment in research and development, about creating an enabling environment for AI to flourish, to international cooperation, those types of things that everybody needs to do to build an ecosystem around AI, regardless of which part of the value chain you sit in or how you're going to participate in the AI value chain. All of those policy recommendations are needed. And so it really isn't about, sort of pitting one thing against another. On the values-based recommendations, I think, they've been very solid, and we've seen them taken up across the world in many different contexts. And I could say that our initial review, which we just got finished discussing in the last few days, looks like there might be some tweaks we'd want to make, maybe some clarifying language, but generally speaking, they're really solid. They apply to generative AI and large language models, and probably a lot of other developments that we'll see over time. And so I think the principles are stable, even if we make updates to them, and we have the ability to do that. I think a lot of the core of what has been there the last 5 years is unlikely to change. We're still going to have priorities around safety, around security, around human rights, around transparency and accountability, and all the things that are reflected there now. But the principles are only as good as they can be put into practice. And so our job for the last, generally at the OECD, but certainly on the AI front, has been to try to observe and assist countries in putting them into practice. And so right now we monitor developments in more than 70 countries with regard to the implementation of our principles, of the principles. And we've done that through many different mechanisms, but a couple to highlight for this audience is through our AI observatory. So if you go to OECD.ai, that's where you can not only see the principles, but you can see that what we call an evidence base of what we've tried to put together through a variety of data sources and working with many countries around the world, well beyond the membership of the OECD, to understand what's happening in AI developments. For example, where investment's happening, where patents are going, where research collaboration across countries is happening, where knowledge sharing is taking place, so that we can understand how AI is developing, and then ultimately to help advise in policy to enable AI. So to the opening part, we're not either doomsdayers or technophiles. We're trying to look at this this dynamic, and one of the most important dynamics in technology, and understand how we develop it in a way that is going to be beneficial for everybody. And it's not just about OECD countries, many of whom are also from the global south, but also about advancing a collective and global AI path that is respectful of principles that can be shared across the world, and I think are shared across the world. A couple of highlights I'll mention. On the OECD AI Observatory, you can find policy approaches from more than 70 countries. You can look at data from a lot of different places, but the most recent thing that might be interesting here is an incidents monitor that we've launched on the topic of safety and understanding. So this is, of course, after the launch. You were just talking about, when should models be put out, and there's been a lot of discussion this year about codes of conduct and accountability, and how we can monitor progress in the private sector and in companies. And I think we have a lot to offer there. But I also just want to say we recently launched an AI incidents monitor that looks at incidents related to AI systems. And I think over time, as we build up this evidence base, to start to build a picture of where AI is being used, where it might be causing problems, where it's not causing problems, or it's gaining efficiencies. We're at the tip of that iceberg, and the data are very new and very limited at this point. But we have to start somewhere and start to build that evidence base. And that's a big part of what my team's contribution to the AI space, in addition to the principles and keeping them moving, is to work globally and to provide that evidence base so that we can make better policy about how to guide AI's development. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Audrey. Just very briefly, we need to turn to Mathis, who has been patiently holding on this whole time. Thanks so much, Mathis. I wanted to kind of transition very quickly in this last few minutes that we have. We've been talking a lot about high-level principles and policy decisions and broad approaches, but Mathis, you have a lot of experience kind of translating from the principle level into practice. And so given SAP's experience in supporting organizations to adopt and deploy AI, I want to hear from you about the kinds of risks and trade-offs that companies are facing and they're trying to navigate as they're trying to put principles into practice, as they're trying to align with transparency, as they're trying to be responsible in the way that they deploy AI. How does that map onto very practical decisions, like whether to contract with an external organization or to build and deploy in-house? How do they navigate existing frameworks that show up in a practical way? So it would be great to hear from you on your experience supporting businesses as they navigate that landscape on the kind of tactical and practical scale.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me now well.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think there are two sides to this question. So first, it's important to understand SAP's AI strategy. Our strategy is about embedded AI embedded in our products. So most of our customers expect us, or they want to benefit from AI, not through building solutions and we provide them technology. They expect solutions built by us in a safe way and to benefit from AI through software updates, basically. So, and this is really our mission, to deliver safe AI that is easy to adopt with very little friction for the organization, for the companies using those functionalities. But nevertheless, we think it's important to understand that, or to keep an eye on what is the difference between B2B and B2C applications, because for B2B, for example, we have professional risk management on both sides. So we feel responsible in delivering safe AI, and our customers, they have more resources, more expertise than a typical customer. So it's a close together to really make sure that everything is safe, that we provide safe functions, and we also help our customers to adopt a safe way with working with this. I would say this is different to B2C, where you don't have this professional, pragmatic collaboration when it comes to adopting AI. And we know that business AI has a huge impact across all industries, and we try to build AI-powered business processes where all industry sectors can benefit from. And so before I come to another point that is completely different for B2B, or not completely different in B2B than in comparison to B2C context, is the other side to the question is we also have co-innovation customers, partners, and internal developments. And here's really where we try to drive innovation for the whole SAP ecosystem. And also this is where we face most of the challenges and complicated discussions that we have to do. And there we try to act as a role model for the whole SAP ecosystem and to show how you can, or how safe AI is developed. One good example is also in 2018, we published our AI guiding principles. And by now, every feature released by SAP has to go through an AI ethics check. And these guidelines, they were created before AI, Gen AI. So we considered, okay, they are not really matching Gen AI, and it's our responsibility to provide safe AI. So we said, okay, we will treat every Gen AI case a high-risk case. And high-risk case means it has to go through an external AI ethics board review. So every Gen AI feature and every Gen AI-based feature that we published or worked on this year went through this external review. And it was more than 50 cases, and only 2 of them had additional requirements for the development coming out of the review. And the external board can put additional requirements. They can even stop the development and say, okay, this is a red line, and it's actually a red line. So you ask about trade-offs. We are not doing trade-offs. There are clear red lines that we are not crossing. We check our things that we release with external review, and we checked more than 50, and only 2 had additional requirements. And this is, I would say, we see a lot of B2B or business AI cases where we say, okay, here is very little risk. We check with this. As I said, everything went through an external review, and the evidence is clear. Only 2 out of more than 50 had some additional risk. And those were both HR cases. So one was job description generation, and one was interview question generation. And we said, okay, HR is a critical field. We have to be cautious. We want to manage the risk here. So we put there were additional requirements in the development, but by now we released the features. We are convinced they are safe to use, and we put a lot of safeguards and also educate our customers on how to use them safely, what to do, what not to do. So if I remember correctly, there were also part of the question about like buying model, make or buy. So this also often a discussion in the B2B context. So maybe if I have 2 more minutes, I also would like to touch on this, because this also then comes with the question, okay, who is a trustworthy partner, where you can buy things from, and how you, like this is talking about AI value chain, which I think is a very big topic to understand that a lot of AI applications are developed in a close collaboration between different companies, open source components. You can basically buy every component needed to build an AI. You can buy data sets, you can buy training environments, you can buy infrastructure. And so it's about AI value chain. We have to find a close collaboration. And then, like a lot of people ask about make or buy models. I would say this changed completely with Gen AI. Before, there was no real option. with proprietary models, and we do a check, and if we feel confident in the solution, we are happy to provide them to our customer or to our partners in a way, and we feel responsible in making sure that this is being used safe and we put the safeguards in place. I hope I covered all dimensions of your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much, Mathis. And we are unfortunately right at the 1 minute mark, and I'm having to make the decision about whether to take questions or switch to final remarks. And I think I'm going to get in big trouble with the Carnegie India team if I don't go straight to final remarks. So I'm very sorry for not having time to take questions from the audience. If you have questions, please find the panelists afterwards. But maybe we can go through very quickly with any final remarks, maybe keeping it to 10, 15 seconds if you can. But please, Sunil, maybe we can start with you.
I think one of the things that has been implicit in this conversation is that AI is large. I think there's a lot of exciting AI that's really small and will run on mobile phones and Raspberry Pis. And that's also an area of AI to be very excited about and regulatory questions to be grappled with.
Just keep it simple. I think you can be both bold and innovative and responsible at the same time. It's not contradictory.
So when we talk about responsible AI, so we not only have to worry about the companies that are developing it and whether they are being protected, but also whether the end user who is affected by decisions made by these AI systems also has a say in the development of this technology.
Yeah, I think I forgot to answer your access question actually. So just a few words on that. Clearly, there's not enough currently done to enable access, especially for global south players. So we need to look beyond models. We need to look beyond data. We also need to look at the full stack with compute and with chips being available.
Audrey, can we move to you next?
Yeah, thanks. Just to say that I think principles are really important, but understanding how we put them into practice is even more important. And so look forward to continuing to work with the global community on putting that evidence base behind how we put largely principles that we all agree to into practice so that they can be really observed in the technology that we're using every day today and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks. And Mathis, you get the final word.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that AI, we need a holistic grasp on the topic. We need technicians, we need cultural experts, we need a lot of different views, a lot of different stakeholders sitting together and to get a handle of the complexity. And we need technical solutions. There are not enough global challenges and crises that have to be solved. And I'm convinced AI can help with some of them. And so we should embrace it. And with all stakeholders together, we can do it in a safe way.
Great. Nice words to end with. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the panelists. Please join me in thanking them with a round of applause.